Possibly taking a very short detour from the book. I mean, on the question of why I felt isolated pushing a baby around small town Britain, actually the explanation for that was very simple. Most of my peers had a year's maternity leave, which, by the way, is pretty good compared to how things are for most American women. In Britain, you have a statutory 6 months maternity leave. Everybody gets that paid maternity leave, and then you can take a further 6 months unpaid, and most women take the full year, which is a staggering amount of maternity leave compared to the situation in America, where I believe something like 1 in 3 mothers is back at work pretty more or less before she's even stopped bleeding after having a baby, which to me is frankly just barbarous. But leaving that aside, I mean, how we got to a point where most women with dependent children work, and it's around 75% in the United Kingdom, is a long story in which the feminism of freedom is intricately bound up, as I'm sure you're aware. But really the reason I felt lonely pushing a baby around small town England was very straightforwardly. There was no one to talk to, because most women were at work, and really I think that was the first article I ever wrote when I first started to write in public was a reflection on the slow draining away and the slow whittling away of civil society, which had taken place as a consequence of most women embracing paid work, which, to be clear, has a great many positive consequences, but also has had this effect that really it's only retirees and a dwindling proportion of those public-spirited boomers who are left, who are really holding my small town up in terms of having a functioning social fabric. Full stop. And, I clung to those older women who organized child baby groups and what have you. And gradually I found a social life, and, life began to feel more normal again. But yeah, I mean, very, very straightforwardly, the reason I felt lonely was because I was no one to talk to. And this is a coordination problem, as I'm sure you can see. If there's nobody to talk to, the only way for there to be more people to talk to is for there to be more people, and nobody wants to be nobody wants to be a stay-at-home mum because there's nobody to talk to. So it's kind of a vicious circle. But just secondly,
definitely.
But just secondly, on the question of heroes' journeys for women, I actually wrote, not in the book, but elsewhere, I wrote a short essay about this a couple of years ago, because in my observation, there is a hero's journey for women. It just doesn't follow the same track as the male one. And in fact, it has 3 parts which correspond to a very ancient archetype for what a very ancient female archetype, which is the maiden, the mother, and the matriarch, the triple goddess, who's a figure out of some pagan traditions, in which these are the 3 faces of the same goddess, as it were, but they take on different aspects at different parts of a woman's life. And anecdotally, to me, it stacks pretty closely with what actually a majority of normal women's lives look like. As the maiden, you're free, you have a sort of warrior aspect, and perhaps that's the point where you're pursuing ambitious professional projects. The mother is more oriented towards home and the domestic sphere, and probably just doesn't care about work as much. I mean, I know a great many very high-powered maidens who reached motherhood perhaps in their early 30s and then just found they just didn't care about the deadlines and the spreadsheets anymore. Couldn't give a stuff. I mean, this anecdote, I'm sure, anecdotally that's pretty common. And then, but then later on, and this was something that I found very interesting when I did a psychotherapy training in the late aughts and early 10s, was just how many of the trainees on that course were women in their 50s and 60s. So these were women who, for the most part, already had young adult children. Their kids had gone off to university or were soon to leave for university. So they'd pretty much done the motherhood arc. They'd done the mother part of that. And they were moving into a new phase of life. They were moving into what I think of as the matriarch space. I mean, I think the classic 3-part goddess term for this is crone. But I mean, they were some way from cronehood. These were lively, vital, energetic, public-spirited women who had some life experience. They had a lot of connections. They had a rich social life. They'd met lots of people, and they were ready to give something back. It's in my observation, there are a huge number of women who reach the end of the mother arc, the mother part of that hero's journey, and then embrace and will then retrain. So they'll have 3 careers. They might have so they'll be very professional in their 20s. They'll be somewhat more part-time, maybe 30 to 50. And then they'll retrain and they'll do something like psychotherapy, or they'll do ministry, or they'll do spiritual counseling, or they'll do in some other way become involved in the community, and they'll want to do something public spirited and give back. And those women are a hugely rich force for deepening reflection in the culture, for public service, for all manner of incredibly positive, usually quite self-effacing, but incredibly positive, constructive, and life-giving contribution to the social fabric. And they're incredibly marginalized. They're almost completely invisible in terms of the liberal feminist narrative, which really centers the maiden. And it wants to foreground the maiden and to tell women that the hero's journey means essentially being the maiden for their entire life. And everything else is just, the mother is pretty much, at best, if the mother is noticed, it's as a problem to be solved. And the matriarch doesn't really get a look in at all. And if she does, it's only so that she can be denounced for being a TERF, or, in some other way, spat on for being, a dinosaur or obsolete or, old fashioned or, out of touch or in some other way irrelevant or ridiculous. And in fact, these women are the backbone of the social fabric. I mean, those are the women who are making weak cups of tea for slightly traumatized new mothers like I was in small town England and telling me I'm doing fine. And really that mattered a lot at the time. Those are the women who are running brownies groups for no money at every Wednesday because they can and because they want to give back. Those are the women who are retraining as counsellors and helping traumatized people for free. Those are the women who keep things going. and yet somehow the liberal feminist version of the hero's journey just doesn't see them at all. And I think so I've been very keen to make a case for a richer, if you like, a three-part, opening a space for thinking about women's heroes' journeys in a more spacious way, which actually just observes what life looks like for mothers and for in the arc of what the average woman's life looks like when she does when she does become a mother.
Well, so that de-emphasis on mother and matriarch, let's say, if you look at it through the same lens that we assess short-term mating strategies, that we use to assess short-term mating strategies in men, you can make the same case for women. So if you assume that not all ideology is motivated by positive and upward striving, what would you say, love of humanity. So why downplay the role of mother and matriarch? Well, because you want to maintain your freedom not to be who you choose, but to maintain your freedom for an excess of, let's say, immediate gratification on the sexual and consumer front. And so what that would imply, and I don't know of any research done on this because mostly it's been done with men on the psychopath side with regards to sexual behavior. My suspicions are that a fair number of these feminists who are pushing the freedom idea, when freedom is the same as licentiousness, are naive, immature, and somewhat dark triad or tetrad-oriented women, psychopathic, cluster B, borderline, etc., who are looking to justify their refusal to grow up and accept responsibility by clothing it in ideological guise and offering a utopian story. It reminds me of Pleasure Island in the Pinocchio movie, where all the delinquents go to have a very fine party all of the time and to trample over everything underfoot, and who end up, sold to the invisible slave masters that are toiling far below. So, it's very dangerous for us to underestimate the role that the R-strategist psychopathology plays in the construction of ideologies. Right? It's a major problem, and we're not good at dealing with it.
I think when it comes to the motivations of feminists, I'd be a little bit cautious about. I personally would be cautious about writing them all off as immature inhabitants of Pleasure Island. There are certainly some among what I would characterize as magazine feminism, which is to say, not serious feminist theorists, but the the feminism which falls out of Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl in the 1960s, which is really the girl boss feminism. It's the feminism of Cosmopolitan magazine, and it's really a thin ideological veneer over what is fundamentally, as you say, a hedonistic project. It has very little to do with feminist political theory in any sort of meaningful, thoughtful, well worked out sense. I mean, there's a huge body of very serious, very passionate, and very worthy, legitimate feminist work which still goes on, which I would wholeheartedly defend. There are those women who are active on behalf of incarcerated women, for example, or the great many women who are standing up to protest the incursion of men into women's sports or women's prisons, for example. Those I would also characterize as feminist. And so really, I just want to offer a moment or two of really positive, positive sentiment on behalf of the great many women who stand up, as I would like to think I do as well, and say, no, actually, sometimes women's interests really do differ from those of men, and sometimes they need to be, and we need to defend ourselves on our own terms and our sexed interests and in their own right, because sometimes those things can be marginalized. I believe that remains a legitimate project because men and women still exist, and we still differ from one another in some politically salient ways. So I would not lend my support to a project to dismiss all of feminism as a childish hedonistic project. However, I'm 100% with you on the kind of magazine feminism, and particularly where that has reached a point where it's not even willing to accept that sex differences as such exist even meaningfully anymore, and has instead moved into a project of pretending that we can all just be formless and identify as we choose in the interests, I don't know, of further self-actualization or further hedonism or whatever it is that those guys want. Like that's, to me, that's not feminism. It's something, I mean, it's barely skin transhumanism or some other kind of ism, but it has very little to do with the serious political work, which is still ongoing, which I believe has a right to a place at the table.
Okay, so let me ask you then why you would consider that more serious work feminism and political, because perhaps you could make a counter argument that good men and good women aren't opposed in their fundamental orientation, and that the project to demonstrate that needs a nomenclature that's other than feminism. I mean, I don't know. This is a genuine question, right? Because the problem with feminism is that, well, you pointed out one of the problems is the cosmopolitan version of feminism. But that's actually also not the worst version. The worst version is a extraordinarily bitter and devouring, what would you say, antipathy to the patriarchy as such, conjoined with fundamental hatred of men.